For years he lived in plain sight, flying freely, hosting the powerful, untouchable by the law. The victims spoke, and no one listened. Then, just when the world was about to hear the truth, everything went silent. What really happened behind the walls meant to protect justice? The ocean was calm that morning, its surface smooth and indifferent, as if nothing in the world could disturb it. Beyond the water, behind tall iron gates and manicured hedges, stood a mansion that looked like a monument to success. White stone, symmetrical windows, palm trees trimmed with precision. From the outside, it was the kind of place people associated with power, control, and achievement. Inside, it carried a far heavier weight. Jeffrey Epstein had mastered the art of appearing untouchable. To those who met him briefly, he was composed, polite, almost invisible in his confidence. He spoke softly, listened carefully, and surrounded himself with the symbols of legitimacy. Bookshelves filled with classics, photographs with influential figures, planes waiting on private runways. Everything about his world suggested credibility, respectability, safety. But power rarely announces its darkest intentions. The first whispers didn't come from journalists or investigators. They came from young women whose lives were already fragile, girls who needed money, stability, or simply someone who promised opportunity. They spoke of invitations that sounded harmless, even generous. A massage, a simple task, easy money, no danger. Just rules that slowly shifted, boundaries that quietly disappeared. At first, their stories sounded too scattered to form a pattern. Different cities, different dates, different circumstances. Yet the details echoed one another with unsettling precision. Rooms that felt too quiet, instructions that came with a smile, doors that closed softly but firmly. Luxury became a cage, and silence became the price of survival. Many tried to tell someone, a teacher, a friend, a local officer. The responses were almost always the same, skepticism wrapped in politeness. He was important. He was connected. He was generous to charities. Why would a man like that risk everything? Doubt fell heavier on the accusers than on the accused. Meanwhile, Epstein's world continued to expand. Flights crossed borders without scrutiny. Properties multiplied. Guests arrived and left, unaware, or unwilling to be aware, of what lingered beneath the polished surfaces. The system around him didn't just fail to question him, it protected him, slowly and efficiently, as systems often do when confronted with inconvenient truths. The women grew older. The memories didn't fade. Shame and anger intertwined, shaping lives in ways no settlement or apology could undo. What haunted them most wasn't only what had happened, but how easily it had been dismissed, how invisible they had felt in a world that listened only to wealth and influence. Years later, when the first official charges finally surfaced, they didn't feel like justice. They felt like a compromise, a deal negotiated behind closed doors, far from the faces of those who had spoken up. Epstein walked free, lighter than before, as if the system itself had whispered reassurance. This would pass. But some stories refused to stay buried. The silence cracked, not loudly, not all at once, but enough to let light seep in. Investigators returned to old files. Journalists compared notes. Survivors found strength in numbers. What once seemed isolated began to look systemic, organized, deliberate. And for the first time, the man behind the gates appeared vulnerable. He didn't panic. He calculated. Power, after all, had always been his language. Yet somewhere beneath the calm, the certainty began to erode. The world was watching now, not closely enough to guarantee justice, but enough to make escape uncertain. This was no longer just about one man. It was about how easily institutions bend when confronted with influence, about how long silence can be bought, and about what happens when the truth finally refuses to be ignored. The gates still stood, the ocean still shimmered, but the illusion was beginning to collapse. Time did not heal what had been done. It rearranged it. For the women who had spoken, the years after the deal felt like living inside a contradiction. On paper, the case was closed. In reality, nothing had ended. The memories returned without warning, during ordinary moments, in crowded rooms, in quiet mornings. Silence had been imposed, not just by fear, but by law, money, and disbelief. And silence, once enforced, becomes heavy. Epstein's name continued to surface in places that suggested legitimacy: conferences, foundations, introductions that carried weight. Each appearance felt like a reminder that the world had chosen convenience over truth. Those who knew what had happened learned to recognize the pattern: admiration first, doubt later, if ever. The system didn't need to erase the past. It only needed to look away. Journalists began to circle again, cautiously at first. Old leads were reopened, not because institutions demanded it, but because persistence has its own gravity. Notes from forgotten interviews were pulled from drawers. Timelines were rebuilt. Flights were traced. Properties were mapped. What once looked like coincidence started to resemble infrastructure. The survivors noticed the shift before anyone else. Calls returned. Emails followed. Questions grew sharper. Not sensational, not dramatic, just precise. Names, dates, locations, patterns. For the first time, someone wasn't asking if they were telling the truth, but how it had been allowed to happen. Still, fear lingered. Speaking again meant reopening wounds. It meant risking retaliation, public exposure, or being dismissed once more. Some declined. Others hesitated. A few decided they had already lost too much to remain quiet. Courage didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated slowly, through shared stories and mutual recognition. Meanwhile, Epstein adjusted. He reduced visibility, delegated movement, calculated proximity. The confidence remained, but it carried a different tone: measured, alert. Power, when threatened, does not vanish. It adapts. And adaptation often looks like restraint. Authorities faced an uncomfortable reality. Revisiting the case meant confronting their own past decisions. It meant acknowledging how warnings had been minimized, how deals had been struck, how procedures had been bent. Accountability, once delayed, becomes dangerous, not just to individuals, but to institutions that prefer continuity over correction. Behind closed doors, discussions shifted from dismissal to damage control. What could be contained? What could be explained? What could no longer be denied? Each answer narrowed the space for silence. The public, still largely unaware of the scale, sensed something unresolved. Rumors circulated. Headlines sharpened. The story refused to stay small. It pressed outward, demanding coherence, demanding consequence. For the women, this moment felt fragile. Hope and exhaustion existed side by side. They understood that exposure did not guarantee justice, but invisibility had guaranteed nothing at all. What had once been buried under agreements and influence was rising, not explosively, but relentlessly. And in that slow emergence, a truth became impossible to ignore. Silence had protected one man, but it had damaged many lives. The question was no longer whether the past would return. It was how much it would reveal when it did. The knock came quietly, but its meaning was unmistakable. In early 2019, the past Epstein believed he had outrun finally caught up to him. Federal prosecutors, armed with evidence that could no longer be dismissed as anecdotal or outdated, reopened the case. This time, there would be no sealed agreements negotiated in the shadows, no quiet resolutions. The investigation was broader, sharper, and far more dangerous for everyone involved. What changed was not a single testimony, but the accumulation of many. Survivors who had once spoken alone were now speaking together. Their accounts overlapped in ways that were impossible to explain away. Flight logs matched memories, addresses aligned with timelines. The same routines repeated themselves across years and locations, revealing a system built on predictability and control. When Epstein was arrested, the image broadcast to the world was starkly different from the man who once moved effortlessly among elites. There were no gates, no staff, no carefully curated surroundings, only handcuffs, cameras, and a silence that felt unfamiliar. For the first time, power did not shield him. It confined him. The charges were severe. Sex trafficking of minors, not rumors, not insinuations. Federal crimes carrying the weight of long sentences and public reckoning. The courtroom atmosphere shifted immediately. This was no longer about impropriety. It was about organized exploitation. Behind the scenes, pressure intensified. Investigators wanted more than a conviction. They wanted names, networks, proof of complicity. Epstein, for years the quiet center of an elaborate web, now represented a liability to many who had once benefited from proximity to him. The question wasn't whether he knew too much, it was who feared what he might say. Inside the detention facility, his world contracted rapidly. No private planes, no visitors of influence, just fluorescent lights, locked doors, and time, long stretches of it. For a man accustomed to control, the loss was profound. Guards watched, cameras recorded. Procedures existed precisely to prevent what everyone feared. And yet, unease lingered. Journalists began to report on irregularities, on staffing shortages, on malfunctioning equipment, on protocols that existed on paper but dissolved in practice. The system that had once protected Epstein outside now struggled to contain him inside. Public attention surged. Speculation grew louder. Social conversations shifted from what he had done to what he might reveal. Each day he remained alive felt significant. Each silence loaded. Then, abruptly, everything stopped. Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Attempts at resuscitation failed. Within hours, the headline circled the globe. Before testimony, before trial, before answers. The official explanation came quickly. Suicide. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some accepted it as the inevitable collapse of a man facing the consequences of his actions. Others questioned it instinctively. The circumstances were too convenient, too final, too unresolved. Broken cameras, guards asleep, checks missed. In a case defined by silence and protection, the most consequential silence of all had just been sealed, and with it a deeper question emerged, one that no report could fully contain. Was justice denied by death, or was the truth buried with him? The news spread faster than facts ever could. Within minutes, disbelief overtook shock. Within hours, doubt eclipsed the official narrative. A man whose life had been shaped by protection, influence, and carefully engineered outcomes was suddenly gone. Without testimony, without trial, without confrontation. For many, the timing felt less like coincidence and more like interruption. The Metropolitan Correctional Center became the center of a new storm. Questions piled up relentlessly. How could a high-profile detainee under suicide watch weeks earlier be left unmonitored? Why were cameras malfunctioning at the exact moment oversight mattered most? How could routine checks simply fail? Authorities offered explanations. Staffing shortages, human error, technical problems. Each answer sounded procedural, detached, accurate perhaps, but emotionally insufficient. The public was no longer willing to accept failures as isolated mistakes. Too many safeguards had collapsed at once. Too many unlikely events had aligned. For the survivors, the news landed with a quiet devastation. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something colder. He was gone, but nothing had been resolved. Their stories remained intact, but the one man positioned to confirm the scope of the network would never speak. Justice had not arrived. It had evaporated. Media coverage intensified, shifting from crime to consequence. Experts debated probabilities. Former officials defended institutions. Conspiracy theories flourished, fueled by distrust earned over years of unaccountable power. In a system already fractured, Epstein's death didn't restore confidence. It exposed fragility. Investigations were announced. Internal reviews, external audits. Each promised transparency. Each faced skepticism. History had taught the public to expect conclusions without accountability, reports without repercussions, truths summarized, not confronted. Behind the scenes, reputations were quietly reassessed. Distances were recalculated. Associations once flaunted became liabilities. Silence returned, but this time it felt defensive. The absence of Epstein did not erase the questions. It amplified them. What lingered most was not the manner of death, but its effect. The trial that could have mapped responsibility never occurred. The testimonies that might have validated years of pain remained fragmented. The system had failed again, not dramatically, but definitively. In death, Epstein became what he had been in life, a barrier, a closed door between truth and consequence. The case did not end that day. It transformed. From prosecution to suspicion, from evidence to implication, from justice to narrative. And in that transformation, something fundamental shifted. The world realized that some crimes are not buried by exposure. They are buried by endings that come too soon. While one name disappeared from the headlines, another refused to fade. Ghislaine Maxwell had always existed in the margins of Epstein's story, present, yet often overlooked. To some, she was a socialite. To others, an assistant. To investigators, she became something far more consequential. The connective tissue. The one who stayed when others passed through. The one who translated power into access. Her arrest shifted the case in a way Epstein's never could. Unlike him, Maxwell would face trial. The evidence unfolded methodically. Testimonies described a consistent pattern of recruitment, manipulation, and normalization. Young girls were approached, reassured, and gradually conditioned to accept what should never have been acceptable. Maxwell's role, prosecutors argued, was not passive. It was deliberate, strategic. She earned trust, then leveraged it. In court, the atmosphere was different from the spectacle many expected. There were no grand revelations, no explosive confessions naming world leaders. Instead, there was something quieter and far more damaging: confirmation. The survivors' accounts aligned. The structure was real. The abuse was organized. The system functioned because it was repeated. Maxwell listened. She took notes. She avoided eye contact. The defense tried to fracture credibility. Memory fades, motives shift, trauma distorts. But repetition weakened those arguments. When stories echo across years without coordination, denial becomes fragile. What once seemed unbelievable became unavoidable. For the women who testified, this was not closure, but it was recognition. Their words were entered into record, not negotiated away, not sealed. Spoken aloud in a room designed to weigh truth. That alone mattered. The verdict arrived without theatrics. Guilty. It did not satisfy every question. It did not expose every name. It did not repair what had been broken. But it established something the case had long lacked: consequence. Outside the courtroom, reactions were mixed. Some called it partial justice. Others, symbolic accountability. Many acknowledged what it was: a rare moment when silence failed to protect everyone involved. Maxwell's conviction reframed the narrative. The story was no longer centered on a dead man beyond reach. It was about a system proven to exist, about enablers, not myths, about how exploitation survives through cooperation, not isolation. The public, forced to recalibrate expectations, faced an uncomfortable truth. Justice, when delayed, arrives incomplete. But incomplete justice is not the same as none at all. And still, the largest questions lingered. Who knew? Who ignored? Who benefited? And walked away? The trial answered how it happened. It did not answer why it was allowed to continue for so long. By the time the courtroom emptied and the headlines thinned, something unexpected remained on trial. It was not a person. It was a pattern. The Epstein case had stripped away the illusion that abuse thrives only in secrecy. What it revealed instead was how visibility, prestige, and influence can function as camouflage. The question shifted from who did this to how was this allowed to endure so long without interruption. Institutions reviewed themselves publicly and quietly. Prosecutors re-examined past decisions. Law enforcement agencies defended protocols that had failed in practice. Each statement emphasized procedure, not responsibility. Each explanation acknowledged error without naming consequence. The public noticed. Trust, once fractured, does not mend through technical language. It demands accountability that feels human, clear admissions, meaningful change, visible consequences. In this case, those elements remained scarce. Survivors watched as debates unfolded without them. Panels discussed legal nuance. Commentators analyzed logistics. Experts debated probabilities. Yet the core experience, the vulnerability, the manipulation, the dismissal, rarely occupied the center for long. The system had a way of recentering itself. Still, something had shifted beneath the surface. Parents asked harder questions. Institutions faced new scrutiny. Victims of unrelated cases found language for their own experiences. Patterns once dismissed as isolated incidents were recognized as structural failures. Awareness spread, not dramatically, but persistently. The Epstein case became a reference point, a warning, a benchmark for how power distorts accountability when left unchecked. It was invoked not because it was unique, but because it was familiar. What unsettled many was not just what happened, but how predictable it now seemed in retrospect. Early warnings ignored, marginalized voices dismissed. Settlements prioritized over truth. Protection extended upward, never outward. The system, designed to deliver justice, had instead delivered insulation. And insulation, when layered with influence, becomes immunity. Calls for reform followed, some sincere, some performative. Policies were revised, training expanded, oversight promised. Yet skepticism endured, shaped by history. Change announced is not change proven. For the survivors, progress was measured differently. In being believed, in being recorded, in being heard without interruption. These were not victories, but they were steps away from erasure. The case had done something rare. It had exposed not just criminal behavior, but the machinery that allows it to persist. And once seen clearly, that machinery could not be unseen. Justice had not arrived whole, but awareness had arrived awake. In the end, there was no dramatic revelation, no final confession, no single moment that restored balance. What remained was quieter and heavier. The Epstein case concluded not with resolution, but with awareness, an understanding that justice is not only what happens in courtrooms, but what systems choose to see, hear, and protect. The failure was not sudden. It was gradual, normalized, and repeated until it became invisible. For the survivors, life moved forward in uneven steps. Some reclaimed parts of themselves through testimony. Others carried scars that no verdict could soften. Their courage did not rewrite the past, but it reshaped the record. They were no longer whispers. They were history. The world, briefly attentive, moved on, as it often does. But something fundamental had changed. The myth of the untouchable had cracked, not shattered, but weakened. And in that fracture, others recognized patterns they had once struggled to name. Epstein's death closed one door. Maxwell's conviction opened another. Not toward total justice, but toward acknowledgement, toward proof, toward the understanding that abuse on this scale does not survive alone. It survives through permission, neglect, and silence. The case became a mirror. It reflected not only criminal acts, but societal priorities. Who is believed? Who is protected? Who is sacrificed for comfort and continuity? These questions did not vanish with headlines. They lingered, unresolved, demanding attention beyond outrage. Justice, imperfect and incomplete, arrived unevenly. But truth, fragmented, delayed, and costly, emerged nonetheless. And once truth enters public memory, it resists erasure. This story was never only about one man. It was about what happens when power goes unquestioned, when institutions choose reputation over responsibility, when silence becomes policy. And it was about what happens when that silence finally breaks. Some crimes don't disappear with time. They disappear with silence. A man died before the truth could speak, but the system that protected him remained. This is not just the story of Jeffrey Epstein. It's the story of how power learns to hide, and what it costs when no one stops it.